A hardware store visit for wood stain runs you somewhere between $30 and $80, depending on the brand. The contractor who stains your fence charges around $600. The guys who repaint barn siding quote you $2,000, sometimes more. And nearly every one of those products, from the bargain shelf to the premium stuff, will need to be redone in 5 to 7 years. There is a mixture that colonial American farmers used on their barns, their fences, their furniture, and the interior walls of their houses. It costs somewhere around $2 per gallon to make it home. Some of the surfaces coated with it are still holding color after 150 years. A few minutes in, I want to tell you something that nobody making content about this formula ever bothers to say. So stick around for that, because it changes how you actually use the stuff. And by the way, every video on this channel is built around spending less and getting more out of your house. If that sounds useful to you, feel free to subscribe. Now let's get back to the video. Somewhere around 1650, a farmer in rural Massachusetts had a barn that needed protecting. He did not drive to a paint store. There were no paint stores. He went to his kitchen, grabbed a bucket, and made what he needed from things he already had. Milk from the morning milking, lime from the masonry pile, whatever pigment he could get, iron oxide from the soil, ground charcoal, plant-based dyes. He brushed it onto the wood and it dried within hours. By the time he checked it the next morning, it had fused to the surface, not sitting on top like a coating, bonded. The casein proteins in the milk had cross-linked with the calcium hydroxide in the lime and created a material that modern chemists classify as a mineral binder. Basically, a very early form of what we would now call a cementitious coating, except it came from a cow. This was not one farmer's trick. Every region of pre-industrial Europe and colonial America had a version of it. Swedish farmers painted their wooden farmhouses red using a recipe based on iron oxide, rye flour, and water. Those farmhouses still dot the Swedish countryside, the same Fallon red you can see in photographs from 100 years ago. The paint on some of them has not been touched in decades. In the American South, the thick coat of whitewash on old stone and brick buildings use the same chemistry. Slaked lime mixed with water and sometimes casein or animal fat, applied over and over each spring. I've actually written down a bunch of these old formulas in one place. The kind of stuff people used before there was a product on a shelf for every little problem around the house. A lot of people who've started using them are telling me they've shaved close to $5,000 a year off what they used to spend keeping their house in shape. It's linked below if you want to start saving on the next project instead of this one. By the mid-1800s, milk paint was so common in America that furniture makers use it as a matter of course. Shaker craftsmen finished almost everything they built with it. Their philosophy was simple construction, honest materials. Milk paint fit because it was cheap, it dried flat, and it did not outshine the joinery. You can walk through a Shaker museum today and see pieces made in the 1840s with original milk paint that still looks intentional. Not worn out, not sad, like it was meant to age that way. So what is actually happening chemically when this stuff dries? Milk contains casein, which is a phosphoprotein. When you mix milk with lime, the high alkalinity of the lime causes the casein to unfold and then rebind in a denser structure. It hardens. During that process, the proteins physically penetrate the porous surface of the wood or plaster and lock themselves in at a molecular level. The result is not a film on top of the material. It is a modified layer of the material itself. Compare that to acrylic latex paint, which is the standard wall paint most people use today. Acrylic dries through evaporation. The water leaves, the polymer particles smash together, and you get a plastic film sitting on the surface. When that film is breached, moisture gets underneath. The paint starts to bubble. It peels. You need to strip it and start over. Milk paint does not peel because there is no film to peel. The bond is part of the substrate. When it wears gradually and evenly the way stone wears, with a patina rather than a failure. Old milk painted furniture does not look broken down. It looks old. Those are different things. The pigments that work with milk paint are the natural mineral oxides, iron oxide for red, brown, and yellow, lamp black for deep charcoal, titanium white, ultramarine, raw umber, burnt sienna. These same pigments were ground into frescoes in ancient Rome and medieval churches. They do not fade the way organic pigments do. An iron oxide red painted on a barn in 1880 is still recognizably red. A synthetic alkyd red painted in 1990 has usually shifted to orange or pink by now. Here's the part most videos about milk paint will not tell you. Fresh milk paint smells. Not faintly, not slightly. It smells like sour dairy and wet limestone, and something faintly animal. Some people find this completely tolerable. Other people hate it. The smell fades almost entirely once the paint cures, usually within a day or two. But during application in an enclosed space, it is real, and you should know going in. The second thing is that milk paint is not a maintenance-free finish for outdoor wood. On exterior surfaces exposed to standing water, heavy rain, or constant moisture, it needs either a top coat of raw linseed oil to waterproof it or a fresh coat every few years. The Swedes knew this. The Swedish Fallon paint formula was modified centuries ago to include linseed oil and iron sulfate, specifically to give it weather resistance. If you are using straight milk paint on an outdoor wood surface and just leaving it, it will hold color well, but it will absorb moisture more readily than a sealed finish would. For furniture, interior wood, walls, cabinets, and any surface that stays dry, none of that applies. Milk paint on interior surfaces is essentially permanent. The shaker pieces are proof enough. The formula itself is straightforward. You need powdered milk or fresh whole milk, hydrated lime, which is also called slaked lime or calcium hydroxide, and whatever natural mineral pigment you want. Powdered milk works better for most people because it is easier to measure in store. You can get a pound of it for a few dollars at a grocery store. The basic ratio is 1 part powdered milk dissolved in 2 parts water, mixed with 1 part hydrated lime by volume. Hydrated lime costs about $5 for a 50-pound bag at any masonry supply store or farm supply. That bag will make more paint than you can use in a decade of home projects. Mix the milk and water first until you get a smooth liquid with no lumps. Then add the lime slowly and stir. It will thicken. Add pigment and keep stirring until the color is even throughout. The consistency you want is somewhere between whole milk and a thin pancake batter. If it is too thick, add a little water. Too thin, add a bit more lime. Apply it with a natural bristle brush in thin coats. It dries in about an hour. After the first coat, the surface will look uneven and you may think something went wrong. That is normal. The second coat evens it out. 3 coats gives you a deep, opaque color with a flat matte finish that is hard to achieve with any commercial product. For outdoor wood, once the final coat dries, brush on a thin coat of raw linseed oil, not board linseed, raw. It soaks in without forming a hard surface film, which means it does not trap moisture below it. Let that cure for 48 hours before the surface gets exposed to rain. 1 quart of finished milk paint covers roughly 50 square feet. For a full gallon, the ingredient cost runs between $1 and $3, depending on how much pigment you use. If you buy pigment in bulk, the cost drops further. Why did this disappear? In 1867, a paint manufacturer named David Sherwin and Henry Williams opened a company in Cleveland. By 1880, Sherwin-Williams had factory-mixed, pre-packaged paint in tin cans ready to ship to retailers across the country. No mixing, no measuring, no knowing anything about chemistry. Open the can, stir, and brush it on. The convenience was real. The industrial paints of the late 1800s were genuinely easier to use than homemade formulas. And as urban populations grew, fewer people had access to farm ingredients or masonry lime. The knowledge of how to make traditional finishes was concentrated in rural communities and craft trades. As those communities shrank and those trades contracted, the knowledge contracted with them. By 1950, the synthesis of cheap petroleum-based solvents and synthetic polymer resins made paint manufacturing even cheaper for companies and even more opaque for consumers. You bought a product in a can. You used it. You bought more. The formula was proprietary. There was no reason for any of those companies to explain the chemistry because explaining it might lead a customer to realize they could make something equivalent for far less money. A few things worth testing before you commit to a full project. The color you see in the wet mixture is not exactly the color you get when it dries. Milk paint dries significantly lighter than it looks when wet. Mix a small batch, brush it on a piece of scrap wood, let it cure completely, and compare it to what you wanted. Adjust the pigment concentration from there. Also, milk paint does not adhere well over existing sealed surfaces. On bare wood, plaster, or previously painted surfaces that have some tooth to them, it bonds correctly. Over polyurethane, varnish, or any glossy sealed surface, it will not bite in the same way. If you are applying it over old paint, scuff the surface with coarse sandpaper first to give it something to grip. And the shelf life on mixed milk paint is short, 2 or 3 days in a sealed container in the refrigerator. After that, the casing starts to break down and the binding properties weaken. Mix what you need for the job. You can always make more. Milk paint is not the right finish for every situation. Outdoor furniture in a rainy climate needs more protection than a straight milk paint formula provides without a top coat. A bathroom floor is not where you want to use it, but for interior woodwork, furniture, accent walls, cabinetry, fences in dry climates, and barn siding anywhere, it does exactly what it did for the people who built this country's farms and workshops. It holds color, it breathes, it ages well, and it costs almost nothing. And the last thing, if this video helped you and you want to keep improving your house without spending too much money, feel free to subscribe. See you soon.